Hello and welcome to an episode of the UFOcast that's actually about UFO. If you're tuning in expecting our monthly For Your Consideration episode on Galaxy Quest, that has had to be postponed, I'm afraid. More detail on that at the end of the podcast. But I want to get straight into our interview with James Swallow, author of Shadow Play, a novel through Anderson Entertainment and an audiobook from Big Finish. I sat down and interviewed him this week. Michael wasn't available, but sent in some questions, so his voice will appear. It might feel a little bit unnatural, but that's because it is. I've just spliced in his questions where I asked them to James. So without further ado, here's my interview with James Swallow. I guess the first question to talk about is, how did you become a writer? A big question, but what made you want to become a writer? How did you become a writer?
It was just I can remember at school just sort of like, spending way too long writing short stories in English class. And my teacher would be like, the lesson's over, James. You have to stop writing now. And I'm like, oh, but I'm really into this. This thing is really cool. And I think maybe, that was in my sort of like pre-teens. I think that was like the first time and sort of like the bug of that had kind of bitten me. I was a voracious reader. We didn't have a very big house. We didn't have a lot of money when I grew up. So my parents, one of the first things they did is they took me to the library and said, here's lots of free books. Which for me was like, oh my God, that's a fantastic idea. And so, I was constantly reading all the time, just like hoovering up whatever I could get. And I broke the reading curve at a very early age. So my parents would sneak me into the adult library as well. So I was reading I went through all the kids' sort of science fiction stuff. And I was like, can I try that other stuff? And they were like, oh yeah, it's fine. So I'm reading all these sort of like these other books and everything. So I kind of just sucked up everything like a sponge, as mostly sci-fi stuff because that's what I liked. So I was reading books, I was playing video games, movies, TV shows, comic books, anything I could get my hands on. And when it kind of occurred to me that, maybe you could make up your own stories, wouldn't that be a cool thing? And it was only like years later that I realized that, maybe I could actually do that for a living, but it took until I actually ended up meeting a couple of actual science fiction writers, Diane Duane and Peter Morwood, a couple of writers well known for their fantasy writing and their Star Trek ties. I went to a very early sci-fi convention. I met them, and I can remember saying, I'd kind of like to do what you do, and rather than sort of like go, yeah, okay, kid, and kind of pat me on the head and send me on my way, they both went, yeah, you could do this. It's not magic. You don't have to be some sort of chosen one because there's this kind of mystique that surrounds writers. If you don't know about writing, you have this mystique. And they were like, no, this is perfectly doable. You could do this for a career if you wanted to. Best of luck. And that's with me. And I thought, well, if they say I can do it, maybe I can do it. And that was it. And I got into kind of writing for an audience. I wrote for a lot of different fanzines. Sci-fi fanzines, mostly a lot of it was Star Trek fanzines and anime fanzines. It was very early in the 90s when anime was starting to take off. I was kind of in on the ground floor of that sort of fandom. And off the back of that, I managed to sort of parlay my fanzine writing into writing articles for actual sort of newsprint publications, magazines like Starlog and SFX and that kind of thing, doing interviews. And then I did that for a while. And I was kind of a sci-fi media journo for a while. I did a little bit of work in video game writing as well, in writing about video games. But I just realized that as much fun as it was to be writing about the people writing the thing, I wanted to be the person writing the thing. I got to a point where I think in the course of like 6 months, there's a bunch of magazines I was working for, they all got cancelled in the space of 6 months. And I'd been thinking about like doing some prose writing, and instead of getting to the point where I could jump, I got pushed. So you don't have a choice. So I went off and I pitched a couple of ideas to a YA book publisher for a steampunk western series. And that was the Sundowner series, and that was published in 2001. And that was my first proper prose writing. And once I had those books done, I had something I could take to other publishers and say, well, look, I've done this, I can write. People would pay me money for it. Can I work for you? And that was that's kind of the ignition point for my career as a prose writer.
So you started with your own original works, and you've obviously written a bunch more of your own stuff. But then you've done a load of tie-ins. Like the list is very long. I mean, you've got a great website which kind of details all the different kind of worlds in which you've been allowed to play. So how did you get into writing tie-in fiction, and why is it something that you've played in that sandbox a lot? What attracts you to that?
I always loved reading tie-ins because I loved movies and TV. You know, the idea that there's more stories than the ones that you like. Like Star Trek's a great example of that. You know, when I was interested in Star Trek, we only had like the original series and a couple of movies, and kind of exhausted all of that. And I read all the novelizations of the films and all the TV shows, and I was like, oh well, that's it then. That's all the Star Trek there is. And a friend of mine said, oh, have you seen this book? And it was Vonda McIntyre's The Entropy Effect, which is a very early, terrific Star Trek tie-in novel. And I was like, what, more Star Trek? There's more stuff out there? He's like, oh yeah, it's like, look, there's all this. And I was like, oh great, more of the thing that I love to read. And I'd previously encountered tie-ins with sort of novelizations of films and stuff, like, you know, Alan Dean Foster's novelization of Alien and you know, the Gene Roddenberry's novelization of Such a Motion Picture, and the Foster's Star Wars novelization, you know, which had all added kind of, if you read them, they add more material to those fictional worlds. But then the idea that there are more stories, not just adaptations, that was really cool. And again, I thought I would love to do this because I would love to tell stories with these characters. I'm never going to be able to write an original series story about Kirk and Spock for the TV show because that show doesn't exist. But the books are going on. It's like, could this be something that I could do? And I had the opportunity to do some audio drama stuff for the guys at Big Finish for the Judge Dredd franchise, for 2000 AD's Judge Dredd. And at the same time, Black Flame was another publisher that I was working with, who were doing the Warhammer novels for their Black Library imprint, but they were also doing tie-ins for New Line Cinema movies and 2000 AD, and they were like, well, do you want to try this? And so I got to do a Judge Dredd novel, and I did a little bit of work for the Warhammer franchise, which is obviously, it's not like based on a TV show, but it's a board game, and it has its own sort of rich background lore, similar structure. You know, here's a pre-existing universe with characters and environments and what have you, tell a story in that world. And once I kind of got my foot on that rung, the thing about writing tie-in fiction is it's very different from writing any other kind of fiction. If you look at kind of commercial, proper big boy publishing, it's very, very, very different, the landscape of it, because you have to write to a very tight deadline. You have to write to the structure of the franchise. You have to be able to get the voice of the franchise. There's a lot of restrictions, a lot of extra hoops you have to jump through as a writer. And it's really difficult to do. A lot of people say, oh, I'd love to write a Star Wars novel. It's like, yeah, but it's a lot harder than you think to kind of come in and say, I've got this idea for this existing world and I just want to tell my story. It's like, no, you've got to tick a lot of boxes. You've got to make a lot of people happy. And not every writer can do that because it is restrictive. But I kind of like that because I always feel like you're pushing at the edges of the box to try and tell an interesting story. I look at the restrictions as a way to kind of spur my creativity rather than sort of restrict it. But so you have to have all that kind of tool. And the thing is if you write tie-in fiction, you tend to get tie-in fiction jobs, right? Because it's once you are a proven quantity in that sort of field, because it has a very specific skill set and a very specific set of needs. Editors will go, who's good at this? Right. That guy, you know. So if I go to a tie-in publisher and I say I did all these tie-ins, they automatically go, oh, okay, well, we know this guy can deliver. Whereas if you're a regular author and you say, I'd like to write a tie-in, they don't know if you can deliver to that kind of deadline. So, like I say, you do that kind of work, you get that kind of work. And so that's why a healthy big chunk of my writing career was kind of visiting other people's fictional universes, stories that had given me a lot of pleasure and fun over the years, and say, oh, would you like to add a little bit to this universe, this kind of crazy quilt patchwork of this universe? Would you like to put a little piece of that in? And that's always great fun for me to revisit stories that I've enjoyed, characters that I've had fun watching or reading about, and saying, well, now you get to tell a story. And the UFO thing is just like the latest iteration of that.
You've also written for other things like Stargate, Space 1999, Star Cops, Dan Dare, Old and New Blake 7. So how do you find the voice for each individual style of production? How do you capture that time that something is set?
that is the key. Whenever I'm talking to anybody about, what it's like to write tie-in fiction, that that is the absolute most important thing, because I've read bad tie-ins that don't feel like, oh, did you really watch the show? You get that kind of vibe off of it. And if you're a fan, you can tell right away if it's somebody who doesn't quite get the texture of that world. And it's really hard to nail it down. You know it when it's wrong, and you know it when it's right. And I think the only way that you can really truly get that sense of a world is you have to really steep yourself in it. So you've got to be a bit of a fan of it. You've got to know that franchise. I mean, with the UFO books, I went back and although I'd seen the show a bunch of times, I went back and I rewatched the entire series back to back, just to get myself back into that kind of headspace and remind myself of the cadence and the rhythm of the voices of the actors, and what does the world look like, or just even down to the tiny little details of how sets were dressed, and just little stuff going on in the background, just to put myself into that world. And I think that's the key to doing it. It's any franchise. If you have to find what the essential voice is, because I've written stuff that's all over the spectrum when it comes to kind of narrative voice. So like a Warhammer 40,000 story, tonally, is going to be utterly different from me writing a story set in the era of like classic Star Trek. And it's a question of knowing, how do you change those gears when you slip from one to the other.
And has the feedback from fans been kind of positive in terms of because I would say the UFO book is the only one of yours that I've read, but for me that totally captured particularly the sort of later end of the series. It felt like this could be an episode of UFO. Have you had that kind of consistent feedback that you have captured the worlds in which you've played?
Yeah, I like to think I have. Certainly with the UFO one and the Space 1999 one recently, I've had people saying, oh, this feels like a lost episode. And I'm so happy to hear that, because that is exactly what I was aiming for. Because I wanted it to feel like these were lost novels that had been written back in the 1970s, and someone had forgotten about them and found them under a box at Anderson headquarters and gone, oh, let's publish these. So I tried to make it feel like, even tonally, like the other novels that came out in that period. So I tried to put myself into the mindset of, well, imagine if you were a sci-fi writer in the 1970s, what sort of language would you have used? What kind of things would you have talked about? So I didn't try to update it, and I didn't try to sort of put tone and language in there that's kind of more modern, more 2020s, more 1990s or anything like that. I just tried to stick to sort of that 1970s feel, and then try to kind of write a story that emulates the tone of the show, that feels of a piece with it, but also does something a little bit different. With Shadowplay, I had kind of some direction to begin with. It's when Nick Briggs was the guy who came to me with these projects and said, "Would you like to work on them?" And he said specifically for the UFO story, we wanted something that was going to kind of celebrate Ed Bishop as an actor and Ed Straker as a character. He says, I wanted to be Straker-centric novel. And he said, I wanted to have that feel, like you say, of late season UFO, where it's the Pinewood season stuff, where they're shooting. And he said, give it a kind of prisoner-esque feel. I want that sort of ITC prisoner-esque feel. And I said, oh yeah, definitely. The show definitely kind of goes into that sort of space. So, as well as the series, obviously The Prisoner was a very big influence on that. And also the works of Philip K. Dick, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers. He does so much stuff about kind of, what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of memory and that kind of thing. So a lot of those influences were coming from there. And again, that's all from that same era. Yeah. So it's all me trying to kind of tap into that sense of what feels true to that show.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you as you say, you kind of captured that. Michael and I, when we were reviewing UFO for this podcast, we noted the similarities with The Prisoner, and then we went on to do our own Prisoner podcast. So we're big fans of that kind of stuff. And I think I was just slightly ahead of the big reveal. And when you mentioned Philip K. Dick, I looked on your website and you've listed all the influences. And there's one particular story that you list. Now, we can't say what that is at this point in the podcast because that will spoil it for people who have
what's
not read the book. But I was like, it reminded me of a cliffhanger of a Doctor Who Big Finish, And then I went, oh, and hang on, the underlying that is this particular story from Philip K. Dick, which was perhaps primarily to kind of figure out what was going on. But it's one of those books that, I've listened to the audiobook, having listened to it once, I need to go back, because the story is, I'm sure, and you can kind of speak to this, the story is a very different story when you read or watch it, listen to it the second time round, right?
Yeah. It's like one of those sort of, the twist in the tale is once you change it, it alters the structure of the story. So if you hold the story up to the light, kind of when the first time you're reading it, if you imagine there's a lens and the narrative's coming through, you see it one way, but then that will turn, and you'll never be able to read the story the same way once they're revealed. But hopefully, if you do read it again, you'll see stuff in there that will pop out. You go, oh, that was there all along. I just didn't see it.
Yeah, well, I look forward to the second time round. Could you talk more broadly about Jerry Anderson? When did you first encounter the world of Jerry Anderson, and specifically kind of UFO, and what was exciting about coming into that world?
Well, as a kid, a sci-fi nerd, the Anderson stories have always been part of the kind of British sci-fi landscape for me growing up. And I remember my parents were kind of like, well, if you like rockets and spaceships and stuff, you're going to love this show called Thunderbirds. Putting me down in front of that and seeing Thunderbirds and Stingray and Captain Scarlet were on TV as a kid when I was growing up, but they were like the older shows. UFO and Space 1999 were new when I was a kid, so I kind of saw those as they were coming out. And I can remember UFO being sort of thought of as a bit sort of slightly dangerous, because they dealt with sort of like, it was a bit sexy sometimes. They had stuff in there about drugs and violence, and so that was at the time it was kind of perceived as quite edgy. And Space 1999 being on, I think it's like the latest seasons being on Saturday morning TV on LWT in my region, watching that. I love those shows very much. And I have this really distinct memory. It's silly really, but around the corner from where I lived, there was a building that looked just like the Harlington Straker offices. They had exactly that same sort of design. And as a kid, I used to think to myself, is that like a branch office of Shadow in North London? And years later, I found out it was a labour exchange. When I lost my job, I had to go there to the job centre to sign on. And it was quite mundane. I was like, have you got any jobs for interceptor pilots? It's like, no, okay, But that's something I always remember about that, because it felt like part of the world I was living in a way. I could believe that Shadow was operating in the world that I lived in. Mm-hmm. So that was my sort of experience of that. And then over the years, the Anderson shows have always been part of that world, part of the sci-fi landscape in this country. So every time a new Anderson show came down the pipe, I was like, oh yeah, I've got to go and check this out. And then just in recent years, Jamie Anderson has the same agent as me. And so when I found that out, I said to my agent, oh, I want to meet him. And he said, why? And I said, I just want to say, I love the work that your dad did, and I love the fact that you're keeping it alive. And so we got together and had a chat. And I just wanted to express my love for his dad's work and say how great it was that he was keeping these shows in the consciousness for a new audience. And at the end of the chat, he said to me, if we ever did something, would you be interested? And I said, like, oh yeah, I'd love to work with you on something. And then that led into doing this, and also a little bit of work on the Stingray 60th anniversary comics.
Fantastic. Now I have a confession to make, is that I have tried to get into Space 1999, and the couple of episodes that I've seen have sort of left me cold. I feel it's something that I should try out again, because it feels like something that I should love. So you mentioned you've also written a Space 1999 novel. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What was the background to that, and how does that fit into, for those of my listeners who do know the show, how does that fit into that world?
So that's the Armageddon engine. That's set in the gap between the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2. The show changes very famously changes very tonally between them. So season 1 tends to be quite sort of thoughtful and a bit beige and a bit sort of cerebral. Season 2 kind of pushes the needle way off into the other direction, and it's very bright, very colourful, but also a bit silly. So, but there's a lot more action in it. So I tried to write a story that kind of synthesizes the two, that feels, most people like season 1 better. So it's a season 1 story, but I tried to give it the action of season 2. And I essentially kind of took all my favorite episodes of the show, deconstructed them, and said, okay, out of this kit of parts, can I build a brand new story? And that's the Armageddon engine. And I got to do a bit more of a kind of widescreen version of it, because obviously in a book you can go more places, you can do more things, you can have more stuff blowing up. So so that's what I did with that. And again, I tried to work very hard to make sure that it feels like it's of a piece from Space 1999, that you could watch that show and then go straight to the novel, and it wouldn't feel tonally like it doesn't fit.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process?
Yeah, I often get this question. People say, like, do you have a sort of set process? And I should say yes, but I'm terribly lazy about my things. I'm supposed to keep. I always say to myself, right, get up, get backside in chair at 9 o'clock, sit down, hands on keyboard, finish at 6, 10 till 6, solid writing, hour till lunch, right? That's the sort of like the thing it should be. But what I find is I spend most of the day faffing around, sort of like doing research and stuff. And then I compact all my writing into the last couple of hours of the day and do it in a sort of like white heat of fury, which is really not the good way to do it. I find when I'm in my disciplined mode, I get a lot of work done in the morning. When I'm undisciplined, I end up packing it all into the back end of the day. But generally, I don't wait for the muse to strike. I'm very much kind of like, I think of myself more as a craftsman than an artist. So for me, it's a 9 to 5 job, So, plumbers don't get plumber's block. Bakers don't get baker's block. It's like, you've got a job to do your job. You might not have a great day today, but tomorrow you can come back and rewrite it. Because at the end of the day, if you're just staring out the window and you're not writing, you can't fix it. You can only fix what's on the page. So I'm a great proponent of like, just get it down on the paper and then you can change it, fix it, make it better.
I was once given some very sage advice by the author Ian Banks, or Ian M. Banks, depending on whether you read his sci-fi or not. And he said, if you want to be a writer, don't. Just don't. Give up now before it's too late. If you can do something else, do that. With that in mind, do you have any advice to anyone who wants to be a writer?
You crazy, crazy fool. Well, it's the great thing about being a writer is it is the job that you can do while you have another job. So even if you don't have a lot of time in your life to dedicate, I mean, I'm a full-time writer. This is what I do every single day of the week. Most people can't do that. Most people don't have that luxury. But even if you take just a couple of hours on a Sunday morning to write maybe 1,000 words, if you can do that every week, by the end of the year, you'll have a novel. Mm-hmm. That's pretty, and that's pretty cool. I think all you need to do is you just need to sort of ring fence off part of your life and say, this is going to be my time for writing. And you can build from that. And just, it's an endurance game. It really is. A lot of people think it's a sprint, but it's not, it's a marathon. It's about just sort of putting in the time, just write. Mm-hmm. If you want to be a writer, that's how you get good at it. I always use the analogy I talk about is it's like a muscle. Is if the more you exercise it, the stronger it gets, and the better you become at it, and the more able you become to sort of look at your early work and go, well, that's not great. Oh, I can see how I can improve. I often hear from newbie writers, they'll say, I started writing something and I got halfway through it, I didn't like it, so I abandoned it and I went on to another project. And I'd always say that's a waste of your time, because half-finished work doesn't really teach you anything. You don't learn how good or bad a writer you are. If you finish your thing, I always say, finish it, get to the end of it, then you can look back at it with a sensible critical eye and go, okay, this is where I didn't do very well. The next thing I will do is better. But if you don't finish that piece of work, you never learn that lesson. And that you don't get the experience point. You don't level up, as a writer. And I think that's the most important thing, is finish what you start and then look at it with an honest critical eye, and you can build up and up the quality of your work and the quality of your craft.
Mm-hmm. So how many drafts of a novel would you typically do for the work that you do now?
Well, the way I work is I tend to edit on the go. So I do a lot of plotting before I start writing. Not as much as some writers that I know. I know some people who will write like 30,000 words of plotting document for 100,000 word book. I don't do that much. I'll do maybe like 5 to 10,000, depending on what kind of work it is. But I get a good sense of the structure of it in my head. And then what I do is I'll sit there and I'll start writing. Every day I set myself a writing target of how many thousand words I'm going to do based on what the project is and the deadline. But I will go back to the previous day's work and I'll edit everything I did the day before to kind of get me up to speed, and then I'll do the writing for that day. So I'm constantly kind of writing, editing. So some people will just write all the way through and then do a draft from the end. But so I'm kind of editing on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
And then when when I reach the halfway mark, I kind of put everything together and I do a halfway point edit, and then I do a full edit when I'm at the other end. So it's kind of like 2 and a bit edits and plus these kind of little mini edits all the way through, rather than doing sort of multiple drafts. Yeah, so I edit as I go, and then I'll have the halfway edit, and then I'll have the full edit, and then it's not exactly the final draft, but to me that's the kind of like, okay, I've now finished writing, and that's the version I'll send out to maybe a publisher or my beta readers, and then maybe there might be some more edits and some nips and tucks here and there. But for me, that's kind of the job done at that point.
Given the nature of what you do, I guess it's very difficult for you to talk about what you're doing now, but particularly if it hasn't been announced yet. So, 2-part question: what can you tell us about what's coming next, as it were? And is there a world that you haven't played in yet that you would like to play in?
In terms of what I'm working on right now, I can't talk much about it. I'm working on a new thriller novel, which hasn't been announced yet. And I've got another comics project that's going to be coming up later in the year, and another video game project, which is very super top secret that I'm not allowed to talk about. So right now, I've got a bunch of things in the works, none of which I can really speak about. So watch this space. Keep watching my Twitter feed and my website. I'll talk about that as soon as I can. As to your second question about other fictional worlds I'd love to visit. Oh yeah, there's a load. There's lots of characters and stories I'd love to do. I mean, for a long time, I actually tried very hard to kind of, get into doing a Star Wars tie-in, but that's quite hard to break into doing that. That would be great because I'm a child of the Star Wars generation, so it would be fun to kind of write a story in that world. I did do a video game project set in the prequels era, but it would be great to do a novel or something like that. I think in terms of characters and worlds, I'd love to do a James Bond story or, Indiana Jones. Those are franchises that I really, really love. And then a lot more of the other stuff is kind of obscure, more sort of like culty stuff, like, Escape from New York or Buckaroo Banzai or Tron, stuff like that, cult movies and stuff that I really enjoy that I'd love to do, maybe write like a book or a comic based on them. But generally, there's so many great sort of stories and worlds out there that are so rich. And there's so many of them. I think, it would be fun to sort of, take a little paddle in that ocean and tell a little story.
Is there another Anderson show that you haven't done that you'd like to? What would be top of your list if you had a choice?
Well, I mean, UFO and Space 1999 were top of my list, so I ticked those boxes. I'm really happy about that. I think, I guess Thunderbirds is the big one, right? That's the iconic Anderson show. So to do a Thunderbird story, I think would be a lot of fun.
Do you have an idea?
It's funnily enough, many years back, I think in the 1990s, when the Thunderbirds comics were rebooted, I did pitch a Thunderbirds comic. So I nearly wrote a Thunderbirds comic years ago, and I picked in a masterpiece of absolutely awful timing. I pitched it like 2 weeks before the comic got cancelled. So that's why. So I never had the opportunity to do that. So, but yeah, I mean, I think it would just be fun to sort of feel around in that world. I've just recently rewatched them all again, actually. Mm-hmm. Looking back at it now, thinking, it would be fun to play with these characters and just take them on a cool adventure.
Let's move on to the spoiler chat. So for anybody listening who hasn't read or listened to Shadowplay, go get it. There's a Kindle version, there's an audiobook version, and there's the hardback book. So whichever version, get hold of it. I highly recommend it. But you should probably go away now because I'm going to talk to James about spoilers. So I as I said before, I love this novel. It really captured the sort of mindbender, time lash kind of world. Even early on, I thought, is this a Reflections in the Water kind of scenario? Which, and all those you sort of name check in the book or kind of refer to. But yeah, tell me a little bit about how you came up with this idea of the alternative Ed Straker.
So, as I said before, Nick said we want to do a prisoner type story. So it's like, okay. So it's one man against the system, and obviously that man is Ed Straker. And I thought, well, we've never really seen him in a situation where Shadow turns against him. We saw it a little bit. If you look at the sort of the episode where Paul Foster is first introduced, you get to see what Shadow's like when it's not your friend. And I thought that would be fun to put Ed in that situation, the man at the top. And it plays well into the idea of him being, the character that you see as he develops through the show. Is he somebody who's like, he's got this absolutely kind of rigid exterior, but he's sacrificed so much for the role that he's in, and he's given so much of himself. It feels like a logical progression that maybe at some point he might just start to crack up. And that's what makes it feel real. It makes it feel true, is you can believe that maybe finally, after everything he's gone through, he is starting to come apart at the seams.
Yeah.
Or is it something else? And it's the classic sort of sci-fi story. It's like, I can see something nobody else can see. I'm not crazy. You're all crazy,
Yeah.
And so because it's all inside Ed's head, that's the great thing that we can do with prose. I mean, you could tell this story as a TV episode, but it works so much better as a book because you're inside Ed Straker's head all through the story. We never break out into another viewpoint until we get this final dramatic reveal that the character you've been following through the story is not Ed Straker at all.
Yeah.
He's an alien duplicate that believes he's Ed Straker. He's this sleeper agent version of him. And the only time the perspective changes in the very final chapter where you see the story from the real Ed Straker's point of view.
Yeah.
And it's this scheme within a scheme, the wheels within wheels is that this fake version of Straker has been sent in to replace the real one and create chaos inside Shadow. But he doesn't know that he's this weapon, this tool of the alien. So for him, it's a dramatic twist as well, because he's a sympathetic character. You feel bad for him because he thinks he's the real deal, and then he gets this terrible revelation. It's like, no, actually, you're not. You're just this weapon. How does that affect him? And I thought all of that stuff about the nature of the pliability of memory and the nature of what does it mean to be human. And again, it's coming back to the kind of touching on those Philip K. Dick sort of style references, that stuff that he always used to write about, the nature of memory and the nature of how you perceive reality. All of that stuff, I think, is really great, juicy sci-fi storytelling, and it dovetails perfectly with the world of UFO, which is all about, subterfuge and what is being hidden from us and what is being hidden from the people at Shadow. So it just came together really well. I think it's just a nice mix of ideas that fit really well world of Shadow. And it was fun to get into that, to just put Straker, even if it's this fake version of him, put him through the ringer in that way. And it also gave me an opportunity to put in all of the other characters that I love as well, and have some moments with them. One thing I really enjoyed doing with the book was having some characters articulate questions that I felt the show had never really talked about.
Right.
Giving them the opportunity to sort of say, well, like the conversation I really enjoyed writing was Foster talking to Alec Freeman and saying, we're always on the back foot in this show where we're being attacked by aliens. Why don't we take the fight to them for a change? Have that conversation actually articulated between these two characters and say, well, this is why maybe that wouldn't work, but maybe we could try it, And if you're paying attention in there, you'll see there's a couple of little in-joke references. There's a very oblique in-joke reference to Space 1999, and another one to Doppelganger, the Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. I put a couple of little references to those in there just for fun. But yeah,
I can't remember whether I spotted that or not.
There's a reference. So the space agency in Doppelganger is called Eurosec.
Oh yeah.
So there's a mention of that, and there's a bit where when Foster says, "Why can't we send a spaceship to the alien homeworld?"
Right. Yeah.
Freeman says, "Oh, it's too far away," and he says, "Those nuclear powered designs the World Space Commission are building, they won't be ready for another 20 years." And he's talking export.
Yeah. Okay.
So, you got to get in the weeds a little bit to get that, but I love putting it in oral. It's like, and I've had a couple of fans say to me, "Oh, I got the joke," which is always kind of
Yeah, I mean, the thing I was looking out for was spotting all the references you made to other UFO episodes, because I was trying to work out, well, where does this fit? And you kind of pretty much reference all those later episodes. I was like, well, this feels like it fits in there, but it must happen sort of just after all those other experiences.
Yeah, it's definitely mentally. I put it. This is after the end of the show, right? So
Yeah.
not a lot further on, because we've got the reference to the sort of like the second shadow base being in Los Angeles. I drew a lot of also material. I should give the guys who did the shadow tech manual a shout out as well. Is that was a very useful sort of piece of hardware to have lying around to kind of be able to refer to that. So, when I'm talking about the interior of Shadow headquarters, it's like what room is on what floor. That's that's the document I was looking for to try and make it all feel like it's top of a piece.
Because it felt like we were seeing more of Shadow HQ than we'd ever seen on the TV show before, particularly when you were kind of talking about the going underground to where the mobiles are stored and the computer room and stuff. And it felt like it was the genuine Shadow HQ of the show, but obviously all that was on... It felt in the TV show that it felt like it was all on one floor, and you've suddenly kind of gone, well, here's all these other levels. So it felt genuine, but an expansion that you wouldn't have had on the TV show.
All that stuff's in the manual, so it's very cool.
Thank you ever so much for your time, James. It's been really fascinating chatting to you, and we are so grateful that you've been able to dip into the world of Anderson and write this novel.
Yeah, and I hope they come back and ask me to do another one, because I had such fun doing this. I'd love to do a story with, try and get more of the cast in, do more of an ensemble piece. So, Jamie, if you're listening, you want me to come back? Absolutely. I would love to do another one.
So a massive thanks to James. It was a real pleasure to spend time listening to him talking about his career and about the writing of this UFO novel. And I will just reiterate that I really enjoyed the book. Do go out and get hold of it if you haven't already. If you're a fan of UFO, this is very faithful to the original TV show and fits right in at the end, as we said. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Michael and I have had to take a pause on For Your Consideration for the moment. We don't have a current schedule for when we're going to come back. Unfortunately, we will keep you posted. We fully intend to be back at some point, hopefully later this year. In the meantime, I am dusting off the UFOcast as Joe 90, which is the follow-up to the UFOcast as Captain Scarlet. And so I will be looking for contributions like I had with the UFOcast as Captain Scarlet. So hopefully I'll have an announcement about that pretty soon. So if you have opinions on particular episodes of Joe 90 and would like to contribute, I'll set up a page on the website for you to sign up to do that. And there'll be a podcast announcing that.